Hey there, magical experimenters. Taylor Ellwood here, and tonight we're going to explore the question of how magic works, and I'm going to apply a step-by-step process explanation. I was asked recently when I asked, what questions do you have about magic? A person was like, I want a step-by-step process explanation of how magic works, please. Why does it work? How does it work? Okay, well, we're going to get into that tonight. And I'm doing this video a bit early because, frankly, it's Thanksgiving, and I doubt anyone will really watch this live. But if you do, hey, welcome, and all that good stuff. So first off, I am gonna just say that I do share a lot of what I'm going to be sharing in here. I do share it in my books, How to Troubleshoot Your Magic, and also The Process of Magic, which is a guide to how magic works, and also a forthcoming book that is going to be called Magic by Design, which explores how to design and create your own magical workings. Secondly, there are some other excellent books out there that you may want to read, such as Real Magic by Isaac Bonowitz. I also like Magical Ritual Methods by William G. Gray. And there are some other books that'll share with you ideas about how magic works. So I'm going to start this off with a caveat. What I'm sharing with you here is ultimately my own theory about how magic works. It's based on experiential data. It's also based on careful observations of not just my work but other people's works. And it's based on putting all that together and creating magical workings, but it's a theory. And I mention that because at the end of the day, my approach to magic is always based around the idea of the idea that you're going to challenge what you know by discovering what you can learn, which means that every time I do a magical working, I am challenging what I know by discovering what I can learn in that working. And so I'm always open to the idea that my theory of how magic works could change as a result of the magical working that I'm currently doing. And sometimes it does, not very often, but occasionally there is data that comes in, or variables or whatever else, that indicates that a principle of magic ought to be revised in order to develop a better understanding of what's going on. In general, though, I find that it pretty much is consistent throughout. So let me now share with you my step-by-step process explanation of how magic works by actually using a magical working as an example, because the example I use here will apply across the board. So the first thing that we do in our magical work is we define the result, right? We define what the result is that we want to achieve. Why do we define the result first? Because in my experience, when you do magical workings and you do not define your result, you leave it very vague, or you just kind of leave it up to chance, the magic doesn't typically work that well. A good example of this would even be, I want a job. I want a job is a very vague statement. If I do a magical working for just on the principle of the desired result being I want a job, then any job will do. I'll do a magical working, and if I get a job at a fast food restaurant, well, hey, I got a job. It's not very defined. So I always, with my step-by-step process, I start first with the result and I define it. And I define it in detail. If I'm doing job hunting magic, for example, I'm going to define the fact that maybe I want to work in an office environment, and that I want to work with people that I get along with, and that I want my manager to basically chill out and leave me alone, but at the same time recognize the hard work that I'm doing. As you can see, that's much more specific than I want a job. The other aspect that I play with when it comes to defining results is I also like to define what I don't want. And the reason I like to do that is because when you are trying to achieve specificity with magic and you want to be able to measure your results, you need to define not just what you want, but also what you don't want. Because if you're getting what you don't want as well as what you want, then it's not really as effective as you want it to be. And I find that a lot of people leave this to be a very implicit thing. They just kind of assume that, somehow or another, what they don't want won't show up. Well, in fact, what you want does show up sometimes. So it's really important to recognize that, and in this case, to hone in on not just what you want, but also what you don't want. Okay, so we've defined our result at this point. We've figured out what we want, we figured out what we don't want. Now, our next step, step two of our process for magic, of how magic works, is that we have to define the actions that we're going to take, mundane and magical. If you do a magical working without any mundane actions, it might work. I find though that 98% of the time you typically need mundane actions to complement those magical actions. So I like to include mundane actions. So for the example of getting a job, we defined what we want and what we don't want. Now we're going to go out there and we're going to create our resume. We're going to fill out applications. We're going to go to interviews. We're going to go to networking events, right? We're going to do all of those things. Those are mundane actions. Now, for the magical aspect of it, we have a couple different options. We can choose to create a magical entity to help us get a job. One of my personal favorites, especially when you turn that entity into a career entity, or that magical entity into a career entity that helps you advance your career. Or we could just do a simple out and out practical working. Regardless of what we do, we have to decide why we're going to do it one way or another. Now, if you know me by now, you know that I favor long-term strategic approaches to magical work. So in my case, I would opt to create a magical entity, or I might opt to work with a spirit. I'll be honest with you, here's why I wouldn't work with a spirit. Spirits don't always have the same understanding of our mundane needs that we have. I mean, they don't live our experience. We live our experience. So I would opt instead to create a magical entity that I can impart that particular understanding on. And in fact, here's a principle of magic at work. We're going to get back to that. That in this act of creating the entity, what you're doing is you are specifically supplying it information that it needs to have in order to help you accomplish what it is you want to accomplish. The other route we can take is, again, we can do some type of practical magical working. It could be a spell with a candle and words that you chant. It could be a sigil. It could be something else. What's really happening here is that depending on which route you take, if you're taking the route of practical magic, you're using that practical magic to help you get into the right space of mind to access the potential, the possibility that you're going to get the job that you want. And then what you're doing is you're using that working to help you embody that into your life. I'm going to use that word embodiment very purposely because I talk about experiential data with magic. Well, I'm a firm believer that if you treat magic as an intellectual exercise, then you're going to get exactly that out of magic, which isn't much at all. Magic is meant to be experienced. It's meant to be felt. Um, my approach to magical work in general is based on whether it's a practical magical working or working with a spirit or doing something else, is that I try to ultimately embody the experience, make it part of myself. I literally try to embody it in my physical body. And the reason for that is because when you embody it in your physical body, you make it part of who and what you are. And you're actually taking that possibility, that potential, and you're embodying it in yourself. And then what it's doing is it's working through your subconscious, it's working through your everyday actions to become an actual reality. Because what you're also doing is you're seeding your subconscious with that information that basically says this is what we need to achieve. And if you look at a number of different books on sigil theory, particularly Austin Osman Spare talks about this quite a bit. This idea of seeding the subconscious. Well, what we're really doing is we're embodying it in ourselves. We're creating this receptive space within ourselves that allows us to transform our identity at the same time as we transform the world around us. What's happening is that if we are trying to achieve a specific result, we're not just transforming something external to us, we're also transforming ourselves. This is an essential aspect of magic that many people gloss over or ignore to their own detriment. But any solid magical working necessarily must change the identity of the person as well as the world around them, in my opinion, and based on my experience. What is not changed, if you don't change yourself to embody the reality that you want to manifest, it is very hard to consequently manifest that reality, because that reality is an extension of yourself. We have a symbiotic relationship with the universe, just as we have a symbiotic relationship with spirits. And so that symbiotic relationship necessarily relies upon an understanding that we are creating a connection with the universe, where we're saying, this is what I want to have changed, okay, and here's what I'm doing to make it change. Can you help me out here? And the universe, through spirits or whatever else, says, sure, I'll help you out, but are you willing to change yourself? Well, maybe not. Maybe yes, maybe no. Well, if it's maybe no, guess what? Not going to happen. If it's maybe yes, then you better follow through and actually do it. Now, you go and you do the magical work. You do your mundane actions, and what ends up happening is you align all of that work with the desired result, and you move from point A, where you don't have a job, to point B, where you do have a job because of the work that you have done. The magic has paved the way. And what's really happened here is that it's basically allowed you to access the potential and turn it into reality. That's basically how magic works, in my opinion, based on what and experience, based on what I've seen. Because really what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with probabilities versus reality. And at the end of the day, no matter what type of magical working you're doing, what are you really doing? You're accessing a probability, and you're turning it into a reality. Now, some of you may disagree with me, and that's fine, but here's my challenge for you. If you do disagree, go back through all of your workings. What were you trying to change? What were you trying to access? You're going to find that it was a possibility. It wasn't a reality. I mean, what you had to access a possibility in order to manifest it into a reality. And if you understand that about magical work, what ends up happening is it changes your perspective, because suddenly it's about, okay, if this is a possibility that I want to manifest, what am I going to have to do to get it? Okay, now I start to see this process at work, Taylor. Exactly, because you have a process that you're focused on. You're defining your result. You're defining the steps that you're taking, and then you're executing those steps. That's really my process of magic right there. It's very simple, 3-step process. Define your result, what you do and what you don't want. Define how you're going to go about achieving that result. Then go and actually do the actions and achieve the result. And step 4 would be, if you don't get the result that you want, start troubleshooting. Figure out why you didn't get that result. What did you need to do? Now, all that said, there's some other components that we need to consider or explore. And these components are essentially the principles of magic. The principles of magic are basically how you access the magic in order to achieve the result that you want. When I talk about principles of magic, these are basically, you can consider them the rules of magic, if you will, the laws of magic, whatever else. They're subject to revision. That's why I always say, challenge what you know by discovering what you can learn. But on the basis of doing magical work, what I've discovered is that these principles seem to work. So an example of these principles would be the principle of connection, all right? The principle of connection is based on this idea that if you want to achieve a possibility and turn it into a reality, you have to connect with it. You have to connect your identity to it. You have to manifest it and embody it. The same thing with a spirit. If you want to work with a spirit, you have to connect with that spirit, right? Connection is all over the place. I mean, look at social media, right? We're connecting with each other all the time. The principle of connection is it's just something that's there. The interesting thing about principles of magic that we need to recognize is that they're basically implicit. Unless you actively spend time examining, like, well, what is actually happening here when I'm doing this magical action to make that magical action work, you won't even think about it. I've already talked about the principle of embodiment as well, which is really embodiment / identity. Basically, become what you want to manifest, right? Make it into your reality. Then there's also the principle of results, which I've also discussed, which again comes right down to define your results, define what you want, define what you don't want. But there's of course other principles at play. So with that in mind, let me just, because I'm not going to be able to remember them off the top of my head, let's just go ahead and pull out my wonderful book, The Process of Magic, and let's see what one of those principles ought to be. I think it was talking about, oh, right here. Let's see. Well, the principle of attention, right? What you put your attention to is what you get. And note that I don't automatically that I make a difference between intention and attention, right? Attention is what you're choosing to focus on. Intention is a purposeful exploration of attention. Like if I have an intention to do something, I am purposely choosing to pay attention. We can pay attention to lots of things and not have an intention behind that. I mean, right now, for example, you're watching this video and maybe you notice the art in the background. Okay, you're paying attention to it for a moment. I've called your attention to it, admittedly, but you're paying attention to it. But do you have any intention with it? Not necessarily. So you see, it's one of those cases where this is worth exploring. We have the principle of change, right? Well, if in order to achieve a result, a change must take place, right? Without change, you have no result. If you have a result and you have no change and you want to manifest that result, you have to make changes in your life, in the actions that you're taking, the changes in your identity. So go ahead and read the book if you really want to learn more about it. And the book is in the link for here. But the point that I'm trying to make really is that if you want to understand a step-by-step process of how magic works, it's a very simple thing, and at the same time, it's very complex. The simple thing is I can break it down to 3 steps for you. Define your result, what you do and what you don't want. Define the actions that you're going to take. Execute the actions you're going to take. Simple. The complex part is the principles themselves that are involved. If you have specific principles that you're using, those principles inform the magical work. And it's worthwhile taking some time to understand and explore those principles as it applies to your magical working. In the case of the example above that I used, I had 2 different examples. I had a practical magic working and creating a magical entity working. So let's look at the principles involved in both. Well, we have the principle of results in both, right? We've defined our result and what we do, what we don't want. We also have the principle of change. We've defined the actions we need to take in order to transform something. And I use that word define, so I'm just going to tell you the principle of definition, right? The principle of definition is this. If you define something, then you already are starting to make it into a reality. When something is defined, you have named it. You have essentially categorized it. You've also started to manifest it. You've started to transform it from a possibility into a reality. The change aspect is that you're taking actions. Now let's say we're doing an enchantment. We're doing a sigil, right? So our sigil is going to make our job application or resume stand out to the minds of other people. Well, we're using the principle of connection here because we are using the idea that the resume / sigil will connect the recruiter and the interviewer with us as a way to get us to the point where we have that interview. And we're also using it with the idea that it's going to make us stand out in the interview, right? So there also, we may have the principle of attention at work because suddenly this person is paying attention to us, and we can put our intention into that principle and say also in terms of that we're going to intentionally make sure that we stand out and that we enhance our presentation. We can also explore the aesthetics of magic at that point too, because that's a principle as well. So the aesthetics of magic would be, in this case, what are we going to do to create the right appearance impression on this person? Well, the sigil itself will help, but when I go into the interview, I might go and do some type of visualization where I imagine myself shining and being very, just standing out in a way that all the other people aren't. And in fact, I just kind of make them seem to disappear into the background. So these are examples right here of principles that are at work with the actions that you're taking. So if you want to understand how magic works, you need to understand the principles. By the way, you don't have to use my principles. You can come up with your own principles if you want, but you need to understand how those principles work. I just find that when I look at my working and other people's workings, I can basically say these are the principles that are at work here. This is why your magical working is or isn't working, et cetera, et cetera. Because it's very easy to take stuff apart. You just have to understand the underlying mechanisms. If you don't understand the underlying mechanisms, then it won't work. If you want to really understand how magic works, understand not just the process itself, but what's informing the process, what's making it work. In the case of the entity, we have our defined result, right? And we also have the step of creating the entity itself. We'll create the housing, the appearance, which again is a form of attention/intention. We'll focus on connecting with that entity and also connecting that entity to our career, our life. Because ideally, I mean, in my case, I would say if you're going to do a job hunting entity, why not make it a career entity and make it something that's going to help you actually advance through the entire time you're doing your career, right? Simple, effective. That's what I did with my wife. Career entity, and the rest is history. Things have continued to look good and better. So you have that aspect to it. But then you also have the aspect of connection in relationship to tying the entity to the material world. You're creating a physical housing for the entity. You're embodying the entity. And so you have this embodiment aspect coming into play. And that embodiment helps you connect with it in a meaningful way, whether it's a statue or a painting or something else. So all of these things basically come together to create the magical working. And so then you say, well, Taylor, how does magic work then? Magic works through the application of our process and the understanding of the principles that inform that process and allow us to achieve measurable results. It's as simple as that. But it does involve some work on your part, because if you want to understand how magic works, you have to actually take the time to pay attention to those things. And a lot of magicians don't. I'm just going to go do the magic. Okay, great. They've done the magic, but they haven't understood what they did. And some people will say, well, you don't need to understand how magic works. You just need to do it. And my response to that, as always, is no, that's a stupid and idiotic way to approach things. If you don't understand what you're doing, then you have no ownership of it. When you understand what you're doing, then you have ownership of it, which means that you have control of what you're trying to do. Maybe you still won't get the result you want, but at least you'll understand why you haven't gotten that result, because you'll be able to take a look at it. Whereas the person who doesn't understand will do it, and then they'll be like, why didn't I get a result? And they'll be all sad and mopey and everything else and boo-hoo-hoo because they didn't take the time to understand how magic works. And again, come up with your own theory or whatever else. You don't have to use mine, but that's my explanation of how magic works. And it's what informs everything I do in magic, and it's why things typically tend to work out for me when it comes to magical work. Because I have this process at work, these principles that are occurring. And it's something that I've taken that's implicit and I've made it explicit. And the reason I made it explicit is because when it's explicit, it's so much easier to understand, and you start to actually think along those lines in order to achieve results. Okay, folks, for those of you who celebrated, happy Thanksgiving, and thanks for watching. And hopefully that answers your question about how magic works.